as part of a number of videos I'm going to do with regard to CakePHP Q plugin, I'm just going to get a development environment going for this express purpose. So the Q plugin uses some sort of queuing server, and you can find different options here, but the one we're going to use is the Redis one that's in the documentation. And the other thing that we need for this environment for developing with PHPQ is a mail server, so that we can send heaps of test messages and those sorts of things. So it's going to end up being a 5 CakePHP container development environment. All right, getting started. What I'm going to do is just start right from the top. So if you start a Windows terminal and get into WSL, make sure that you're never in anything that says MNT/C, because that'll be very slow. But move across to your Linux folders within WSL, and then you can create, I'm just going to remove that because we've already going to start from scratch, so to speak. So here we go, CakePHP 4Q, and we're going to use a completely fresh install of CakePHP, and yes, and go into here and get our code editor running. To speed ourselves along a bit, we're going to use, that's our just installation that we've just done now, but we're going to just steal some configuration files from a working example. So we have docker-compose.yaml and a .env.example file and a Docker folder with some configuration in it. Just copy that across, and then we'll have a look at what they contain as we go through. So I'll just close these folders. So firstly, in the root of your project folder, you have docker-compose.yaml. And as we mentioned, there's Redis, Nginx, a PHP container, a MySQL server container, and a Mailhog container. Both of these volumes here, there's two volumes, CakePHP 4Q volume and a VSCode extensions volume. They all assist us in persisting changes across reboots. So that will help us, especially with our MySQL. So this CakePHP 4Q volume will host the MySQL database. So when we destroy and recreate containers, we won't be destroying our database each time. Another one, the VSCode extensions directory, needs to be there because this will stop us having to reinstall VSCode extensions every time we destroy our container. So that's pretty much that. The networks we're creating a common network for all the containers so they can all talk to each other, not with any forwarded ports, but with their default internal ports. And we'll go through that as we install. Nginx and PHP both share the exact same path to the CakePHP file. So Nginx has the current directory, which signifies this folder and file source tree, and if we look at PHP, it's exactly the same. So when they're passing information back and forth, they know that they're talking about the same path, so to speak. All right, let's have a look at our .env example, but we'll just copy that across to a .env file and have a look at the content of that. Now, for some reason, whenever you click on this, I have to look this up, but if you click on a file that's got an italics heading and it's italics, when you click on another file, it will close that one that you're open, but if you double click, it will leave it open. So a .env file just has a bunch of environment variables that will pass into the docker-compose.yaml file, and as we can see, each one of our containers that's publishing ports gets one of these environment variables. So we'll refer to those as we go through. The database server, it initializes when it first starts up, it'll initialize the database and volume using these environment variables, and it will create a root password which is the same as DB password, because that's what's configured here. MySQL root password is the same as the DB password environment variable. The other change here, MySQL root host must be this, otherwise you won't be able to connect in from externally to the container database server. It will say, oh, not allowed. So that's another change you might need to make. So there's all our overview a little bit. Most of these containers are using just an image which comes straight from the Docker repository, but the PHP container is using, if we have a look at the settings here, it's using a Docker file with a lot of customizations, and that will allow us to do a few things. We're not running as root, we're running as a user, PHP dev user. We're also installing Xdebug, and that sort of gives us a lot of just tweaks that we're going to make as well. We've also got Composer is being installed as well, so that's pretty much everything there. All right, let's try and get our environment, Docker Compose and built. So when we're building the environment, we're obviously just using all the settings in the Docker Compose YAML file, and yeah, it's basically tweak and rebuild until you get it right. Once it's building successfully, do a Docker Compose up, and if you specify -d, it will background everything, so you won't be getting garbage on your terminal. So at that point, we've gotten all our Docker containers running. Let's have a look at Docker Desktop and our containers, and we can see they're all up and running. The front end is the web server, so we're just going to click on Open with Browser, and we've got localhost 6D88, which equates to, if we scroll up here, there's our web server port, and we'll look at connecting to the other services as well as we go through here. So in there, we know in this screen here, we know that CakePHP is the Nginx container is connecting successfully to CakePHP, and the PHP files are being processed by the PHP container because all this is rendering fine. Now we're just going to look at getting everything wired up. Firstly, it's saying currently Cake cannot connect to the database. So the reason for that is that it doesn't know how to as yet. So open up your app local file. That's under config app local, and go find your data sources array there. And what do we need to connect to? Well, you just refer back to Docker Compose, and we're wanting to connect to the MySQL container. So each one of these containers, you can refer to them because they're sharing a network. They all know, they all can resolve each other by just specifying this name here. So MySQL is the one we're going to do. Let's get app local again. Pop that there. We know that we're using these credentials, so it's all the same. So I can just pop these in. and save, and then reload, and we should have a successful database connection. Now if you want to view your databases, this is where you can use MySQL Workbench. When you look at the connection for MySQL Workbench, basically you create a new connection and give it something descriptive, but then use the port number from the .env file, and it's this forward DB port 5088, and that will give you, you want to test your connection, it's using dev test, which is that DB password, and then once you've got that right, you can connect in with MySQL Workbench. Just download that from, I think it's Oracle that publishes this, but there's a free community edition. So the next thing we've got to do is thinking about our mail configuration. If we go back to here to localhost, we know that looking at dev, the Mailhog dashboard port is 8088. So we get that connected, and we can see Mailhog is available there. So how do we test whether CakePHP has successfully got a connection, and how do we configure this? If we go back to app local and we then click on its neighbor app.php, we can find underneath this email configuration here, we've got two things: email transport, and scrolling down we've got email configuration key here. So I just collapse those to make them easier to select, and just select them, copy them, and then scroll to the bottom, and we find we've already got an email transport key here, so we just copy and paste over the top of that. Now from our app documentation here, app PHP, we find that to send via SMTP, we need to specify a class name with an SMTP transport. So going to here, just change the class name in app_local to SMTP transport. Now if you don't find things auto-completing, just check your installed extensions in VS Code, and you'll find you need to install PHP IntelliFence. Highly recommended. If you're not using that, you need to make sure obviously you do a use statement at the top, and then you'll be able to reference this like this. Now our host name is, well, we know from each one of from our docker-compose.yaml file that each one of these services is referred to via this service name here, so we can pop that in, and inside the container network we refer to things by their internal port. So Mailhog is using 1025, so we pop that in there. So there we have configured our Mailhog server. We can leave the rest as the defaults. Now how do we configure or test, I should say, the email functionality? Well, first of all, we bake a command, and we can call it mail test. And if we have a look, we just collapse our tree here and then have a look under src command, we'll see a mail test command. Now it's simple. Simply we can just do something with the mailer class. So we can say new mailer, and then use the mail command. So we can set to, let's say, example.com, user at example.com, set subject, test connection between CakePHP 4 and Mailhog. And finally, I think all we need to do after that is go deliver the connection is working. Now as we can see, if we attempt to run so we go bin cake with no arguments, we can see that the command is available underneath the app section. So all our commands that we add will be published under this app section. So we just go bin cake and mail test, and I've deliberately done this just to show you that the challenge. So we're in the wrong environment. So everything from a container development environment needs to happen in relationship to the PHP container. So we need to be inside the PHP container, otherwise none of the host names will work, and so we need to get into the container. Now to do that, there's two ways of doing it. We can either choose the container option here in Remote Explorer and then connect to a container and then open a directory, or we can use the Docker button here and then say right click on the container, which is the PHP container that we want to do, and choose to connect in. Now if you haven't connected before, you may need to open this folder, which is var www.html, as you can see here. Alright, so now we were testing our email there, weren't we? So if we go bin cake, we're in the right spot, so we know that by this, and we go mail_test again, what we'll find is that that connection has now been tested and it's working. So notice there, notice we've got a little bit of a nice to have that's missing. Let's go back into and I might close that other screen because otherwise I'll keep, this is the one I wanted to close this one, and we're in our PHP container here, as we can see down the bottom. So let's go and just make a small change there in our app local, and we're looking for our email profile here, and we can just change this so to make it a little bit more pretty. And what you have to do here is just specify the email address as the key and the friendly name or description there as the value. So now try that again, and notice that it's now changed the from address to look nice like that. And that applies, of course, to the mail test command. You can also do that same thing here by specifying an array, and you can prettify the send to addresses as well. So now we know mail is working, and we've got ability to view mails coming out of CakePHP. Now what about the Redis queuing server? Well, a piece of software that we can use to view that is, and I've installed this already, it's called Another Redis Desktop Manager. And if we have a look at our just links that I've got associated with this at the moment, we're looking for GitHub. Here we are. So GitHub, and it's this GitHub repository. And if we have a look underneath the releases, we can see that we've got the option there for Intel and ARM Macs and Linux and Windows. So download a copy of that. Now, how do we connect to the Redis queuing server? Again, we know that all the containers publish their services on these forward ports here. So 7088. I'm just going to click connect, a new connection, and leave the host empty and just choose to connect to the port that it's published on. And we can see by the statistics that we're seeing that we can now look at our queues that have been created by the CakePHP queue plugin. So there's our basic configuration to start developing using the CakePHP Q plugin. So I will have this published. If we just have a look at the working repository. If you want to get this code, it'll be under that there. So I hope this is useful to someone.